Rolling.
Well, this is a documentary on research primarily, and it's
Rolling?
we go into cancer research.
Yep.
But before that, the first question I was asking is research in general, whether you call it the space program and what that has delivered to humanity, or even before, like what happened after Hippocrates and after Galen, and we get to modern research. Is there a philosophy behind it, and how does it change? And I know you've got a separate, a personal philosophy about research.
I certainly have a philosophy that research is best done as a team game, and that if you can bring people together with different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of looking at the world, you can give them a common light on the hill, so a common place that they want to get to with their science, but give them a lot of latitude about how to get there, then I think those environments and those teams can be incredibly dynamic and incredibly successful. And there's, I think, as part of bringing those people together, thinking about those individuals that have a deep understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve from kind of a humanity or a practical view, for the community. And in cancer research, they're often the clinicians. They're also the patients and their families. Those are the people that are living the disease in a way. And for me as a basic scientist, talking to the community and talking to the clinicians that are dealing with the impacts of cancer was a great way to focus my mind on what the big problems were. But also I think that communication can go the other way. As a basic scientist, there are sometimes things that my team were discovering that might solve a problem that the clinicians hadn't considered. So I think that push of the research and the pull of the research is part of getting that team right and getting that philosophy right.
And it can be serendipity as well, can't it? You don't know. Research for research's sake. I mean, there has been the philosophy about it needs to pay its way, but that's not really how research works, is it?
No, it's not quite how research works, though I do have a view that if you're taking public money, the public is entrusting you to do something, and having an eye to how that research could, if it makes a breakthrough, benefit the world, I think is important. And it doesn't mean that every single researcher has to be the one that goes and engages with a pharmaceutical company or patents or communicates. But within that team, I think there is a responsibility for people to have an eye to how the research ideas could be applied in a practical way. So I don't think it has to be everybody doing the same thing, but I think there's a responsibility for institutions to assemble teams that can push things towards impact.
This might be a hard question for you to answer because I don't know many people who know the answer. When did research start as a profession? I mean, how recent is it?
So that's a great question. And my answer would be tens of thousands of years ago. So, and that might seem a strange question, but that might seem a strange answer. But thinking about our First Nations people, you have communities that have thrived incredibly, that have not just the longest continuous culture, but one of the richest cultures. And that has developed over 65,000 plus years in a environment that is incredibly unpredictable and incredibly harsh. And you don't survive and flourish in that environment unless you're asking quite profound questions of the universe about you, and then answering those questions through observation and through experimentation. And then what I think is incredible is communicating that down thousands of generations. And as a scientist, I'm paid to do that research. I'm paid to do research. For me, if I publish a paper, which is one of the ways scientists communicate, if that paper is cited 5 years after I publish, I'm kind of giving myself a big pat on the back, doing a little dance. So to have ideas and answers and ways of looking at the world communicated down thousands of generations, I think shows that we have a lot to learn from the way science is done by First Nations people, not just in Australia but around the world. And I think the more Western view of research, of experimentation, reproducibility is an extension of that thing that probably humanity's done from day one. I don't think the kind of professionalisation of research is a particularly big step. I'm a pretty nerdy person, and when I go on holidays, I get a little fidgety and bored. So I started doing unpaid science when I went on holidays, looking at biodiversity, understanding particular families of moths, writing papers, things like that. And I didn't feel that my contribution as a citizen scientist in that realm was any less rigorous than my contribution as a paid scientist in health and medical research. So I think we can glorify the role of professional scientists, but I think that way of thinking, the way of building knowledge and the way of communicating knowledge is probably something core to humanity.
See, I like to hear that, because I don't want people holding researchers up to be the be-all and end-all, except they need to understand what research is to be comfortable.
Absolutely.
As you said before with fundraising.
Yeah.
What the hell is a researcher? Why am I giving them the money?
Yeah.
What are they doing? Okay, well, you can say they're absolutely concentrating on one thing at a time. Is that necessarily good? That's the sort of...
Yeah, so I think you've hit the nail on the head. One of the most important things for science to be able to make a difference in the world, right? And the reason the community is supportive of science ultimately is, that science is one of the mechanisms by which we can tackle some of the really profound challenges, whether it's an incurable cancer, whether it's climate change, whether it's the energy transition, whether it's understanding our biodiversity. Science has a really important role to play in finding the answers to those challenges. But those challenges are only going to be effectively deployed if the community has another ingredient, and that's trust. And it's not trust in an individual scientist or a trust which is good, but it's not just trust in individual scientists or in organisations. It's trust in the process. And I think the thing that distinguishes science from politics or religion or people's opinions on social media isn't that the scientists are smarter, and it's not that the organisations are more or less reliable. It's that the process is something that can be trusted and relied upon. The fact that, as a scientist, the lead singer inside my head is doubt. So every time I look at the world, every time I think I understand something, whether it's about science or whether it's about the organisation that I now run, inside my head, I'm always thinking, how might I have this wrong? How might I have interpreted it wrong? Is the data leading me astray? How can I validate my first perceptions about the world? Who can I talk to help me gain that additional understanding? And then, in science, in experimental science, after other people have reproduced similar results to the ones that I've generated, then that lead singer becomes backing vocals, but it never goes away. And I think sometimes there's a frustration in the community because they want certainty. And, when a scientist changes their mind or ideas evolve, somehow that's seen as a weakness, a little bit like we see with our politicians. They backflipped, they're not being constant. For science, that's great, because it means that you have additional data, you have additional ways of looking at the world, and you're willing to modify your ideas and your hypotheses and your advice. And that's why cancer treatments got better, right? We don't want people dogmatically treating patients in the same way they did 40 years ago. We want the way a clinician treats a patient, the way multidisciplinary teams come together to treat patients.
Can I try that sentence again?
We'd like the way multidisciplinary teams come together to treat patients to evolve as knowledge evolves, right? And that requires people to be, doubtful that their current way of treating is the best way and striving for that additional knowledge.
With each breakthrough, there brings another breakthrough on its heels. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true, isn't it?
Yeah.
One thing leads to another, and has been
Yeah.
doing, because the In medical research, if you go back, I think it's fair, right what you're saying, whether it's Sumerian or First Nations people or whatever. Dara O'Brien made me laugh the other day. He said, I don't know if you know him, was a wonderful Irish stand-up comedian. So science knows it doesn't know everything, otherwise it would stop.
Exactly.
And he said that the things that worked we called medicine, and the things that didn't was potpourri.
Yeah.
So yes, we've discovered the medicine in the past, but it doesn't stop us from going forward.
That's right. And I think there's sometimes the question I get asked by my Uber drivers or taxi drivers, after they find out that I've worked on cancer, is, well, when are you going to find the cure? And, the answer is we will probably never stop looking for cures for more different types of cancer. There's some thinking in the community that cancer is one disease. It's obviously thousands of different diseases, and you can make progress, and put your shoulder to the wheel in one area and, increase survival rates. And, even for well-treated cancers, there are a proportion of patients that don't do as well as others. So we want to do better for those patients. We want to do better for those patients who have a different type of cancer has much worse outcomes. So it's about, it's much less about eureka moments and much more about putting your shoulder to the wheel and doing the damn hard work.
Yeah, because breakthroughs just fall from the heavens. There's no hard work behind it. You want to say something about that? Because that's how you get a breakthrough. And suddenly you work and work and work, and suddenly...
Yeah, and, through my career, I've probably published over 40 years, maybe a couple of hundred papers, co-published with other people. And I think there were 3 or 4 that really changed how people thought about the field that I worked in around the world. And then after those papers came out, there was then kind of a new vista opened up, and then you would be very systematic about exploring that new area or that new domain. And that's where it's shoulder to the wheel hard work, right? You're establishing a reliable foundation of knowledge on which others can build, and you're putting that you're turning the volume down on that lead singer in your head, because when you publish a paper that is novel and a bit of a breakthrough with maybe a eureka moment in there, for me the worry always was, how might have I got this wrong, right? And the reason it's interesting and picked up across the world is it's new and novel, but it also means, wow, you probably haven't got all the details right. So it was always that element of then working very hard to make that foundation of knowledge as solid as it could be.
Well, that's Newton's quote, isn't it? Standing on the shoulder of giants.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but I've always thought that was a little kind of vainglorious in a way, right? If you stand on someone's shoulders, then you're seeing twice as high as they could. I've always felt like I was jumping on people's toes, right? So, kind of standing on someone's toes, trying to jump and see just a little way over their head. And that seems to me often how science works, right? There are people who've done amazing things in the past, and if you can not necessarily stand on their shoulders and look kilometres into the distance and get that insight, but if you can just see a few feet in front of where they were, it's pretty good.
Looking over the horizon, another foot gives you another mile.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, just step at a time. Step at a time.
We were doing some research into Crick and
Watson.
And who what didn't they do? And there was a lecture, I think, at the Royal College, about things they didn't do that wasn't necessarily in the book. And so that led us to thinking, well, what is research? If you're standing on other people's research and you join them all together. So we're wondering if we can collapse that into a 2-minute story. I'm not sure we can, but there's lots about, was DNA known before? Yes, it was. It was theory. Yeah.
But DNA was well known as a substance in the cell, just as proteins and RNA and lipids were all known. And, the question that was open for a long time is which of all of those different biochemicals in the cell is the substance of heredity, and then how does that work? And there were lots of people that had ideas and did experiments that allowed, in that moment in the 1950s, Watson and Crick to make their seminal kind of observation, with the help of observations that other people had made who not got necessarily the fame that those two did.
Oh, and what was it? Have a cough, Steve. Have some milk.
Sorry.
Have some milk.
Okay.
Water.
No, thanks.
What's the name? Rosalind.
Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah, Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah.
I thought it was a bit unfair. But also she died before the Nobel Peace Prize as well.
Yeah, I think they sail close to the wind ethically, but who knows? And she was, while she was alive, she was, I think she showed a huge amount of grace.
Well, she's from what our research was, she was happier in Paris than she was in London, is all we found out.
One might ask who wouldn't be. But
Yeah.
hey.
What's that? What made you? How'd you end up in research? I mean, did it happen in school? I love history, and that's something. And I don't know why, what triggered it, but one day I just loved it.
So I enjoyed bits of school. So I found, and I still find, that I can get very excited about narrow parts of the world and not much interested in the rest of it. And that's not a great recipe for getting good marks at school and at university. But then as you specialise, it becomes a bit easier because you can choose the areas of specialisation. So I would find I would obsess about 5 or 10% of the curriculum and, kind of deep dive into that and ignore the rest. And it was like a wave of boredom coming over me when I tried to study things that I wasn't interested in. And I admire people that have that kind of discipline and can sit down and study things and they understand the games of the exams and things like that. It wasn't really me. So it wasn't until I worked in a lab in Canberra over one summer, and I think a lecturer kind of threw my hat in the ring for a vacation scholarship to go to ANU when I was studying at Monash. And I hadn't really thought about science as a career. I was the first one in my family to go to uni. I didn't know any scientists. The way I express it to people is it was like falling in love. That lab worked on blood cells, and I read about blood cells when I went to the lab, and it was glorious. And I realised that, and I'm kind of getting sweaty, like I think about, people I've fallen in love with,
No, take us on that journey. No.
Well,
Tell me about cells and how you fall in love with. Because I'm doing first notions with the cork and all that.
So for me, it was two mysteries. One was, how does the body replace the billions of cells that die every day in just the right number without exhausting the supply of cells? And so there's the blood cell system is self-renewing, and the stem cell that sits at the apex of that self-renewing system has the capacity to divide, produce more cells, but then differentiate or change into the dozen or so different blood cells that are required to fight infection, carry oxygen, clot your blood, do all of the things your blood cells do. So the first question was, this is a mystery. How does the cellular part of the system work? How does this cell know when to produce a red blood cell? How does it produce a red blood cell and 10 different types of white blood cells? So that was mysterious. And in the 1980s, when I was in ANU, there were ways of making progress towards that. And then the second question then is, at a molecular level, at a biochemical level, how is that process regulated? How do the cells communicate with each other? How do we get just the right number of red cells and just the right number of white cells? How do we ramp up production when we might have a bleeding event or get an infection? That was a mystery. That was captured my imagination. And I think the other thing that I found was probably for the first time in my life, I didn't have to explain myself to anybody. You know, not coming from an academic family, people kind of look at you a bit oddly. You know, I had a partner who said she'd never met anybody who knew so much about so little. Right? That obsession is not necessarily a normal kind of, you know, normal run of the mill thing. Can make you hard to live with. And here were a group of people that obsessed about similar things to me. So going into that environment, it was the first time where I didn't feel like I had to explain the sort of person I was. I was kind of accepted, and you know, when ultimately, you know, it was clear I was quite good at doing it. You know, then, you know, it's like being recognised as a good member of a good football team or a good cricket team, right? Yeah, there's a joy of being able to contribute to something that is a team effort and be respected for that. And that's exciting.
That's the ideal, isn't it?
Yeah, you find your place in the world in a way.
There's lots of people in the past, pre this century, did it for private gain, perhaps. Perhaps
maybe.
gain is the wrong word. Because it was not so disciplined if you go into the 1700s, 1800s, was it? You was like, you look at Darwin,
Yeah.
he didn't just do one thing. Like you were broad spectrum.
He worked on lots of different things, right? And it would be interesting to go back to talk to Darwin, you know. But he, you know, upstairs in my office, I have a copy of 2 books that were written by Darwin on barnacles, and I think there were only 800 published, so it's, you know, a relatively rare book. But what I loved about Darwin's barnacle phase was he was already thinking about evolution and natural selection and how species form. But what he realised was, to be credible to the rest of the world, he needed to have demonstrated expertise in a particular area. He couldn't be a dilettante who came in and just said, you know, and here's the way the world works. You know, there was an expectation he would be an expert in a particular area of animals. So he spent 10 years studying barnacles and wrote 4 volumes. So I like and talked and communicated with people voraciously, because at the time Royal Mail in the UK had just started up as a way of communicating with the Empire. So he was an ardent letter writer. He communicated, collaborated with people all around the world, kind of assembled ideas, but also was willing to do deep dives into particular areas to give himself context. So I suspect that, you know, in the back of his mind, he was always interested in how species form and relationships between organisms and things like that. And the ability to kind of work in different areas gave him a context that other people didn't have. So,
well, his research was also his hobby.
Yes, it was, and I guess that's what I mean by obsession, right? So, you know, I think throughout my career, whether I was working on insects while I was on holiday or whether I was working on blood cells professionally, for both of those things would just be percolating around in my head all the time, right? And, you know, as I said, that makes you hard to live with, because you might be having dinner and your wife or family are talking to you and you've just zoned out. And, you know, I guess for me, ideas have come sort of like sediment kind of settling, or jigsaw pieces kind of settling very slowly into place. And it's a very kind of creative and visceral process. So it's not necessarily just, those moments don't necessarily come when you're sitting and looking at the data and concentrating hard and, you know, giving everything your attention. The moments of insight often come having done all of that and then eating your dinner or in the shower or going for a run or looking out of a window. And I think sometimes we've lost that ability in the hustle and bustle of the industrialization of science to have those moments of reflection and give ourselves time for those moments of reflection.
You'll be pleased to know, no. 3 people have said almost exactly the same words that you just said.
Yes, but I don't think many people do it. They're hustling writing grants. They're hustling in the profession, right? And that, walking around when I ran WeHi, walking around the institute, I didn't see many people with their feet on their desk looking out of the window. And that in some ways disappointed me.
The daydreaming aspect of...
The daydreaming aspect, the just letting your mind wander, right? And different people get that in different ways. For me, it was trying to relax, or going for a walk, or going for a long run. Those were the moments where you're kind of the repetition allowed your kind of mind to wander. I think often that was why doing repetitive experiments was good. There was a sort of the actual doing of the experiment is very tactile, and once you'd mastered the being dexterous at it, you could allow your mind to wander in ways. That kind of repetition is sometimes also where you have your ideas.
We were playing with visual metaphors that we can use in the editing. I'm so pleased to hear you say jigsaw, because that was one of the ones we came up with.
Yeah.
It is a jigsaw, is it?
But yeah, it is, and yeah, maze maybe.
You one apparently.
Yeah. I mean, I always felt like I knew there were pieces of the puzzle, but not seeing their connection necessarily. And then there was a moment where you could see connections, or a lot of doing experimental science is not simply having kind of the idea of what you wanted to discover, and part of that is understanding the boundaries of current knowledge and opportunities to be able to push those boundaries. And sometimes, that could be a eureka moment. What if we looked for X? For me, that was, we're beginning to understand the proteins that allow hormones to send signals. And I had this moment of thinking, there must be proteins that turn those signals off. So there was a moment of thinking. And then that's okay, but now you have to find a way of finding them. You have to design the experiments. And then that, again, is puzzle pieces. And there will be a moment where you go, oh, I could try this. And that's because you've read papers that seem unrelated to each other and unrelated to the problem that you're trying to solve, and you can bring in an idea from there and adapt it and think, I know about this system. If I can apply it here, maybe we can discover these proteins. That's exciting, but it's not like an engineer designing a bridge, right? There's not a formula for it. There's not and maybe I'm being unkind to engineers, but there's not it's not a protocol where you just go, okay, if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're bringing elements together in a really creative way. At least for me, that was a really creative process and an enjoyable process.
Well, that's why beautiful bridges are wonderful to behold, because most engineers don't think that way. Is it just 1%?
Well, maybe the architects do bridges have architects, or do they only have engineers? They must have architects too. So, and again, it's collaboration, isn't it?
We've got to do funding.
Yes.
What did you want to cover? The current system of financing?
Before funding, I keep hearing...
You'll listen to the question, but look at me when you answer it.
Sure.
Yeah, your old partner never met anyone who knew so much about so little or something. You have to be so focused, but then the importance of collaboration with people who have a different focus, and how, you're in an amazing position now at CSRA to create multidisciplinary teams that no one's ever really thought of.
Yeah.
And how, I don't know how relevant, I'm just fascinated by that. And then the funding thing, I guess the importance of funding dollars for discovery and stuff like that.
It's going back to watching people spend hours writing out grants. That's the way the system works. Look, we're
Right.
coming from the outside into science,
Sure.
and so these
The
things,
system's broken.
Tell us why.
I think we've designed a system now where people spend 40 or 50% of their time, scientists spend 40 or 50% of their time trying to just accrue the resources they need to do their experiments. Right? That is a kind of terrible waste. I live in an AFL town. Imagine you had your staff all forward, and what that person had to do, he or she, had to do was go spend 50 or 60% of their time, getting their salary in order to play football, right? But as against train and hone their skills and develop that understanding with their teammates, right? I don't want my star footballer out at the local pub doing the chook raffle, right, or the meat tray raffle or whatever it is. I want people that have those skills that are unusual and that society needs to be putting their minds mainly to solving the problems confronting the community, not in the soul-destroying process of writing grants, the chance of which they're going to get any individual one might be 5 or 10%. Right? That seems to me to be a system that is designed suboptimally. So, CSIRO is an interesting place, right? We get $1 billion as a single grant from the government, and I think it's our responsibility to utilise that freedom that we have to bring teams together and allow them primarily to focus on solving the problems the community wants us to solve. And I think in kind of universities and medical research institutes, we've moved away from that. And I think probably to our detriment in many ways. There's an interesting book that has caught the imagination of people in Canberra called Abundance, which talks about some of the ways science and technology has come off the rails in a way to be able to deliver the big solutions to big problems, and that the conservatism of grants and the conservatism of peer review and the amount of time people have to spend now just bringing the money together to do their science, I think, is part of the problem. And
the problem is not enough money as well.
Well, that's an interesting question, right? What is the right amount of money, right? And I don't think as a nation we've ever answered the question, what's the right amount of money? We've grown the funding pool, so through the 80s and 90s, and there were challenges with the amount of funding. The NH&MRC's budget was doubled and redoubled, and we created the Medical Research Future Fund. But at the same time, we built more and more buildings to do medical research in, so that if you go to one of the big universities, Sydney or Melbourne, maybe 50% of the whole university is now doing health and medical research because we've grown the funding. We train more and more students every year. Those students want to be doing science. We've never asked the question, what's the workforce size we need and what's the funding pool that would support that workforce? Grown organically, and therefore the pressure in the system has built kind of over time. And one of the great things about ACRF funding was that it came in large amounts, that it filled the need for equipment that was acute, and it backed people to do brave things. And, I think the way ACRF have stuck to their mission, they haven't tried to do everything. They filled absolute need in the cancer research community for cutting-edge equipment that would allow researchers here to make breakthroughs and bring breakthroughs from overseas to the benefit of patients in Australia. I think that's been fantastic. They would back people in.
7 minutes. Could you walk me through the grants process? Because we're lay people. Everybody in science knows it backwards.
Sure.
People watching the documentary will go, oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the grants process at one level seems very sensible, right? So as an investigator, I have an idea. I need to employ people. I need to buy reagents. I might need to buy some equipment in order to take that idea and see if it's going to pan out. In the case of cancer, it may be, can I discover a new target so that we could develop medicines to treat something that is untreatable. Pancreatic cancer is a good example. And there's the current system places the responsibility on me as an investigator to convince my peers that my idea has merit and is a better idea than other people's ideas, so that within a limited funding pool, my idea gets the funding. Right? And we do that by writing grants. So we give an introduction, the context, we talk about why this idea is important. We have to provide assurance to the people that are reviewing that idea that it's feasible. Often the way you do that is by providing preliminary data that tells them that you're on the right track and you're heading down there. And then it gets reviewed by 5 or 6 different people from within the cancer research ecosystem. So that all sounds very sensible, right? You know, it's the way of getting the highest quality work out. You know, and maybe if 50% of the applications were funded, that would be relatively efficient.
Because it's competitive.
Well, there's a level of competition, but you have a good chance over a couple of years if you've got a good idea of it getting up. Once it becomes 10% of the ideas are funded, what you find is, you know, there's really very little difference between the scores of grants that are successful or unsuccessful, right? It becomes somewhat of a lottery about who's getting money. But the other thing that happens is, you know, something that I've seen often with big breakthroughs. mRNA vaccination for COVID is a great example. Before the pandemic, there were a couple of companies, BioNTech and Moderna, who were developing the use of mRNA as a therapeutic. If you'd have asked 100 people in 2018, what do you think of this strategy? I reckon 96 of them would have said, yeah, RNA never going to work, right? Those companies' share prices were pretty low. I think that's a good reflection that the market, you know, was not super excited that this was going to be the game-changing technology for vaccine delivery and cancer treatment and things like that. So if you'd have done peer review on that, those people wouldn't have got funded. This is pie in the sky stuff. There's no track record. There's, you know, everybody's a doubter for really genuinely breakthrough technology until everybody thinks it's obvious. So, you know, there's a sense in which the way we've constructed the peer review system probably makes it harder to do really groundbreaking things. So
It doesn't reward risk, does it?
It doesn't really reward risk. It doesn't really reward people kind of out there. The benefit I had growing up was a little bit like CSIRO in the 1980s and 90s. I got a single grant. Went to the director, Suzanne Corey, in my later time there, and Gus Nossel before Suzanne. And it was up to them to dish that grant out to different people. So until I was 33 or 34, I hadn't applied for a grant other than for my own salary, right? So I had one grant through that period. It was a 5-year grant. I got my salary, so I could just go off and try things, right? And I could try that idea around what turns those signals off. I could test that idea. You know, my mentors, the senior researchers in the team could back an idea, right? It wasn't about external people. You know, they kind of knew I was bright. They knew I was reading well. I'd discuss ideas with them. They would get excited and they could back you in. And that's very different to the way it is now. And, you know, I genuinely wish there was a way of going back to supporting teams, supporting people who are working towards that light on the hill. And for us, it was how are blood cells controlled. That everybody knew what that was the mission.
How did that work out?
Worked out really well. Worked out incredibly. And that was not. I wasn't the one who lit the light on the hill. That was a guy called Don Metcalf, and the discoveries he made revolutionised the way we treat blood cell problems. And, you know, that team evolved over a 50-year period. and did some incredible things, right? And it wouldn't have happened it wouldn't have happened if only one of us had been there. It wouldn't have happened unless Don had understood that his kind of technological skills were limited. They were great, but they were in one area. And to be impactful, he needed people that saw the world in different ways. And it wouldn't have happened unless we'd had that very long-term support that gave us the ability to test things and pursue ideas for years before we had to then convince the world they were right.
I mean, research, if done well, there's no such thing as bad research. Even if it disproves if it doesn't come up with what you thought.
There's sometimes bad research. So bad research is not so much in the outcome. The outcome's the outcome. I think the bad research is where people don't have that voice of doubt in their head. Right? They start cutting corners because they think they know they're right. Right? They maybe leave some data out of the paper because it's not quite consistent with how they view the world and how they want to talk about the world. Or at the more extreme end, they start fabricating data that supports their view of the world. That's bad research.
Does that happen very often? Do you think
I don't think it happens at a gratuitous level very often. I think there's a lot of pressures to cut corners, and we have to be hyper vigilant to that. And we have, and that's perhaps an intended consequence. It's a bad consequence, but it's a predictable consequence of having a hyper-competitive grant system, right? If you need to get that experiment for the preliminary data to pay for your team and salary, we've created a system that tolerates people cutting corners, right? I think, it's something that as research leaders and leaders of institutions and supervisors of PhD students, we just have to be vigilant about. And and that's why I say we have to kind of turn up the microphone of that voice of doubt in our own heads, and not believe not drink the Kool-Aid of the excitement, right?
Is doubt the right word? Or is
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
You're self-doubting to begin with.
Absolutely have to
yourself.
be proving it to yourself. You have to not, you can be excited, but has always got to be tempered with, how might my view of the world, my interpretations be wrong? How can I reproduce that? How can I begin to just lessen that voice?
So, in its purest form, research, and you're head of the CSIRO, not just medicine, it's everything from agriculture through to climate change. And
yeah.
Does the essence of research change depending on the subject, or is it the essence remain true?
I think that the commonalities are overwhelming. And the most privileged part of the job is talking to young people who make me feel like I was 30 years ago, where I remember going to we've just opened a new building for our wildlife collections. These are the museum collections assembled over the last couple of hundred years in Australia of flora and fauna, so herbarium and the National Insect Collection and the National Vertebrate Collection. I was talking to a researcher in the National Vertebrate Collection who was interested in understanding how the epigenetic marks, the marks that are put onto DNA, have changed as the environment's changed over the last 100 years. So she was going to museum specimens and trying to read those epigenetic marks on lizards that were collected 100 years ago and popped into formalin or ethanol. She was almost vibrating with excitement showing me her jar of pickled lizards, right? And what she could do if she could solve this problem, we could understand how climate change has impacted some of the physiology of these lizards, and what could be a greater privilege for somebody leading a science organisation than seeing that? It was fantastic. And I've seen that in people exploring energy technologies, new energy technologies, and people trying to understand the impacts of climate change or ways of mitigating it, and people trying to find better ways of recycling plastic, or people who are trying to use floating rafts of plants to suck PFAS out of the environment, or I think the commonality of that passion, the depth of knowledge they have for their area, their willingness to communicate it, their willingness to work together, I think those commonalities are overwhelmingly greater than the differences between the fields.
Well, science to me seems optimistic. You and I think everyone here grew up in the same period, 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And it was optimistic. We're all optimistic about the future, which is not so much today. But everything you just said, I remember reading popular science in high school and getting excited about the potentials of the future.
And I think we're at a crossroads, right? I think we as a nation, it feels like the challenges that we're facing are more profound than we probably faced in the last 30 or 40 years. I'm not quite sure that they are. But, I think the crisis of climate change, the urgency to transition the electricity system, changes in biodiversity, they are big, profound challenges. And I think maybe the fact that we're aware of them is probably a very good thing. But as a nation, I think we're at a crossroads of saying, well, science and technology does have an opportunity to help the community solve these problems, but only if we do them at scale and for long enough and give our scientists the latitude to be able to explore the solutions. That does not come cheaply. And what sort of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country that processes our critical minerals into critical materials? Do we want to be a supplier of those materials to the world? Do we want to develop foundational models for AI that are distinctly Australian, so we're not relying on Chinese or American data that might not be as relevant for this country? Do we want to have a crack at trying to do carbon capture, right? Generating green cement is difficult, but it would be a lot easier if we could pull carbon from the atmosphere at a scale that is going to impact the climate. And we need to be 1 million times or 10 million times more efficient at doing that. That's a soluble problem, right? But it doesn't come with small amounts of funding, and it doesn't come with short-term funding. It comes with a commitment to science and a commitment to having a crack at solving these problems at scale with multidisciplinary teams.
It's just thinking back, and again, the moon launch, the landing on the moon and all that. Yeah, we grew up in that time where the optimism was fantastic.
Yeah, as well as the fear from the Russians and the Cold War, and
yeah.
was some different motivations. So
the 3-minute warning in London from
that's
Moscow.
right. Yeah. What was it, duck and roll when the nuclear alarm went off?
Really going to help.
That was going to help. How are we going?
12:05.
Happy with that?
Yep.
All right.
Happy with that?
Very good. Good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to keep talking, but
He stretched to 5 as it was.
I did.
No,
All
it's
good.
terrific.
Thank you.
I think you could be most of the documentary.
Thank you for
Thank
coming
you,
out
Tim.
here.
Yeah.
You've still got friends